Hi, testing. Testing 1, 2, 3. Um, all right, I think we can start. Patrick, just checking, am I audible to you?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Perfect, thank you. Uh, Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Development Studies Association of Australia's webinar series. My name is Pranjali, and I'm the student representative of DSAA and also a PhD candidate at the Australian National University. I will be moderating today's session. Before we get started, just a quick note on the format. This will be a conversation between Patrick and myself. I will begin with some questions to guide our discussion, and towards the end, we'll open the floor to you. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat at any point, and I'll bring them in during the Q&A. Today, we are joined by Dr. Patrick Kilby, who's the Honorary Associate Professor and the Editor-in-Chief of Development in Practice. Patrick's expertise spans NGOs, gender and development, women's labor migration, and international development program management. He is also the author of 4 books. His work ranges from women's empowerment in India to the history of Australian Council for International Development, um, and the role of philanthropic foundations in shaping global development. He is now working on his next book, which is on the story of aid from a global South perspective. We're delighted to have Patrick here with us today. He's going to be sharing insights from his ongoing work, as well as from his recent podcast, the link of which is available on the DSA YouTube channel, as well as our social media profiles. And Patrick is going to be challenging the idea of Global South as an emerging donor. Thank you, Patrick, for being with us here today. To start us off, I was wondering if you could take us through how the Global South has typically been framed in the history of aid, what those framings tend to leave out, and how South-South cooperation has developed over time, from Bandung to the non-alignment movement and to what it is today. I know it's a very heavy question we're going on right away, but just let's just get it started, and then we can probably tease out and follow a chain of thought.
I think the major issue is the whole notion of the global south, or the third world, or developing countries as they've been known over the decades, is one of othering. It is about an other.
Hmm.
And in practice, though, it's been a dialogue, and sometimes a quite ferocious dialogue, between some pretty major countries with their former colonial powers and the like. So the whole thing of the emerging donor I find particularly irritating, because how long does it take for you to emerge? So just a couple of fun facts. India got its independence in 1947. Its first aid program to other countries was to have trainees from Africa do training in India in 1949. The Colombo Plan, India was both a recipient and a donor in the Colombo Plan in 1950. China's first aid was to Egypt in 1956. Zhou Enlai went on a tour of Africa in 1964, and he came up with 8 principles of foreign aid. And I think they started doing foreign aid for about 15 countries first up. And probably the biggest infrastructure project probably was the Tanzam Railway in 1969, which was nearly 2,000 kilometres long between Zambia and Tanzania. And it costs 5% of the GDP of China to build. So China has been very much central, and the global south as well. In India, with its own neighbours, particularly countries like Bhutan, to a lesser extent Nepal and Sri Lanka, but they've certainly engaged with them, and it was rather central to the independence of Bangladesh. So there's a whole south-south narrative going, but the global north tends to other it, and it keeps othering it by suggesting it's not very substantial. In the mid-70s, I think global south, because Saudi was very large with the oil money it had in the mid-70s. So Saudi and China together probably gave more bilateral aid than the West combined in the mid-70s. So the whole othering makes it as if the global south is a bit second class, and the whole global north thing is a bit paternalistic. And the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, it tends to have a rather paternalistic sort of attitude, because it sort of invites global south countries to join it rather than the other way around. Rather than have the DAC principles of foreign aid, why not adopt China's principles of foreign aid? But there's never any thought about engaging in it. So it's very much it's probably a colonial mindset, except not all the global north were, colonial, the Nordic countries, for example, but there is that very strong mindset that we know best, and development is what we have achieved, not what you aspire to. So I think that's where I'm coming from in this whole discussion.
Yeah, it's you already touched upon this a little bit, but I wanted to push a little and ask that do you still find the term global south still analytically useful? Because there are these competing as well as different terminologies used in certain contexts. They are justified, the uses are justified. So I was wondering, in this conversation on foreign aid, what would be the appropriate terminologies to use, which also throws light on how colonial language also shapes the way we look at these places.
Yeah, and often we inadvertently put the language through a colonial lens, but that was never the intention. The term the Third World arose in the 50s, and it was a class-based analysis where the Third World were the workers, if you like, for the First and Second World. Mao Zedong came up with his 3 worlds theory, which again was a class-based theory. And so he had the Soviet Union and the United States as the two hegemons being the first world, the rest of Europe and the like being the second world, as in a middle class, and the third world being the working class. And so it's a very class-based analysis. There's an author whose name escapes me, but a couple of authors, but they wrote a paper called Southern Discomfort. And it's an easy one to remember and easily Googleable. And they make the case that the term Global South, the purpose of it is to make you uncomfortable, because they move a little bit away from the class-based term, which the third world emerged from, but more from a power and privilege and financial control type thing. And the term Global South isn't the south of the equator. It's basically south of the Mediterranean. And most countries south of the Mediterranean fit into the Global South, with the exception of Japan. Japan is the only, Japan and Australia and New Zealand, both Japan and Australia were colonial in their own rights. Japan, with its immediate neighbours for not long in Australia, basically inherited some colonies. So the Global South, I think, is still analytically useful because it's basically a statement about power and control, and particularly financial and even political control. And so, how alliances shape up and all that sort of stuff. So I think it's quite useful. Other terminologies get a bit fuzzy, and while this is fairly stark, it's a binary. And as a binary, even though there's a bit of fuzziness about where China is and what it's doing and all that, it still fits in as an analytical sort of way of looking at things.
Yeah, that then brings me to ask you, how Global North has been positioned as the traditional donor, as well as, and Global South as the emerging donor, and you're challenging this by saying that, you've been emerging since the last 75 years, and when do you stop emerging? So even within the foreign aid discourse, when you have these binaries of traditional donor and emerging donor presented, how do we as scholars sort of navigate these already established conventions of labeling or calling something one over the other, and in that process not sideline the rich history that the Global South has in foreign aid? We'll go into the foreign aid, like what Global South has been doing in a bit, but I just wanted to sort of get the terminologies out of the way and wanted to understand what your thoughts are, and if you would prefer like one is used over the other because one captures the nuances and the intricacies and the deep history of what the history of foreign aid has been in this particular, like in this political climate.
Yeah, I tend to push quite deliberately, partly because to push back against this narrative of the Global North. The whole Development Assistance Committee arose because the Soviet Union was squeezing the United States, essentially, and the Soviet Union is building more dams, more steel plants, and is becoming a major donor in its own right. And the Eisenhower administration in the US was losing out big time. And so it started to heavy Europe, and Europe owed it because of the Marshall Plan to join in. And so, to step up. And so the Development Assistance Committee was formed, and Kennedy took over that leadership role and declared the first development decade. So the whole thing it started off as an anti-Soviet or competition with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union dropped out quite quickly in the 60s and wasn't much of a player, but China came and took over in many ways by the 70s. But part of it was that the Global North, particularly the OECD or the Development Assistance Committee of it, they obviously decided, but to them, controlling the narrative was very important. And so to talk about the global south just sort of, in a sense, challenge their unity as the owner of the narrative and of what development is. There's a whole lot of things around that. The global south, countries like India in particular, start to get very annoyed. Then you have the non-aligned movement was a clear pushback. And there's a whole lot of confusion around as to what was the voice of the global south, partly because the global north through the OECD had a unified voice, partly because the United States, demanded it be unified, sort of thing. So they needed relevance, and so they kept having their own sort of, their own office. If you go to, it's in Paris. If you go to most of the OECD lives out in the suburbs in high-rise towers, but there's a palace in the middle of Paris which they've taken over as the OECD headquarters, and so that's a symbol of their power, sort of thing. And so it's part of that political power. The Development Assistance Committee is part of that power projection in that north-south semi-Cold War. It was a little bit different to the Cold War because that was clearly about the Soviet Union and NATO in the United States. But there was almost another win hearts and minds of the peoples of the global south, which the people of the global south much resented.
Is there something similar to the OECD that the global south has as a form of a unified voice?
Not quite. They tried it. The problem is that after the Second World War, the United States under Truman and Eisenhower, to a lesser extent, having a unified Europe was very important for the Cold War. And so that's what the Marshall Plan was about. And so it got them into having trade and a whole lot of cooperation within Europe. Now, the Global South didn't have anything like that. They did have the non-aligned movement, which sort of worked for a little while, but they had principles of, and they kept breaking their own principles, which made them a bit, where we're not nuclear. But then China had the bomb, and then India had the bomb, and Pakistan had the bomb, And so there's a whole lot of, and it had its own internal conflicts, national conflicts, which the non-aligned movement was very, very unable to have anything, to say anything about. The ongoing conflicts between India and Pakistan, the non-aligned movement was just completely at a loss as to how to manage that. And that, in a sense, weakened it. They have tried the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and they're talking about BRICSAM and adding Mexico to it. I think that they're going to probably become a bit stronger together, partly because the United States is leaving the field, as it were, and so they can. But there's been traditional tensions between China and India, and China and Russia, India, and so it's hard to actually have the level of cooperation or consensus that the Development Assistance Committee has, partly because of the simple geography and what colonialism left, in a sense.
Right. I was wondering while we were having this conversation that how do you, based on your work, what have you noted to be, let's say, the patterns that stand out in how, let's say, the global north sort of designs and delivers its aid versus how it has been done by global south? the reason I'm asking this is it sort of creates, you know, bec- I mean, global north, it's a big umbrella term, and there are so many countries involved, and so is global south, and we sort of tend to clump everyone together under these bigger, broader labels. But then there are certain patterns that stand out, which sort of help us see the similarities or differences. And when I went through, your preprint works, which for our listeners is available on Patrick's ResearchGate profile, you did mention there are certain differences as to the focus was, I think, North was focusing more on developing Europe, whereas when South was doing, the focus was more on having not just economic, but cultural and social sort of development as well. So if you could speak a little bit to it as to what were the priorities between these two blocks as donors, and any similarities or differences, and yeah, pretty much this for now. Because I tend to ask too many questions back to back, so I'm limiting myself to one
um,
before I go
the,
into another one.
the rhetoric is quite different.
Hmm.
The practice is actually very similar.
Hmm.
But Zhou Enlai's 8 principles, they still apply, and China still quotes them. We will pay local staff local wages, which is a complete point against the consultancy and the whole consultant culture. We will use local this and local that. So there's a whole emphasis on the local. But what they do is to the global north perhaps tries to engage in politics as far as what good governance is, and they keep changing that. Every now and then they say it's about democracy, but the most successful countries aren't democratic, so then they try something else. And they talk a lot about capacity building. Well, China tends to, and the same with, I can't link them all together. Saudi has a very strong religious part of it, and it really only gives to Muslim countries. But with China and India to a certain extent, what they do is it's infrastructure. They really emphasize infrastructure. So if a country wants something, then it will have. Sorry, I have a visitor. So, and so if a country wants something, that they tend to oblige. And there's a lot of debate within the global south about China's about China. China's about what China does. And countries are pushing back on having too many Chinese staff building stuff. And as somebody pointed out a few decades ago, a lot of it was training Chinese staff. And so the Global South projects were guinea pigs for what was being built in China. So there's a whole lot of self-interest there. And aid is tied by both countries, despite what they say. Still consult, Chinese equipment, etc. So China's aid never worried about foreign exchange because there was always a barter type arrangement, while the global north tended to be, there was more financial arrangements and a lot more advice given and what have you. So there's a bit of a difference there, but self-interest is very important in this.
Wait, oh my God, the last couple of lines, I think there's a lot to unpack over there. And I was trying very hard to sort of catch up with what you were saying. You said that while from the global north it's mostly financial, but China, for example, focuses on barter. And also you mentioned that global north does more political versus it's more infra focused if it's coming from, some countries in global south. Could you speak a little more to it as to how this plays out and why is it one over the other?
Partly it's a bit ideological, and partly it's a bit It's a bit politically internal. Now, the reason why the global north tends to talk about, oh, we're promoting democracy, we're promoting good governance, or we're promoting business, and we're promoting an investment environment and all that sort of stuff. And people can latch on to that. If we just say we're building rural roads, which is probably the most important thing you can do, people glaze over. So it's partly that. The reason China, it seems to be secretive about the amount of aid it gives, partly because that's for internal reasons. You know, when Kenneth, it was Kenneth Kaunda saw Mao Zedong in about 1967, he said, "How can you afford this railway?" And Mao just waved his hands. He says, "I will just add it to our list of railways we're building," meaning it gets hidden in a line item. And they do some fancy finance work with as loans, etc. So they end up being given as loans, but the loans are forever being forgiven. And there's a whole lot of financial shenanigans going on. So the aid is given, but it doesn't look like aid internally in China, for example. It's for the same reason. There's the politicians everywhere saying, why are we doing this? Why are we helping these countries? And so in Australia, for example, we keep saying, oh, it's related to our trading relationships, etc., or our security relationship, etc. So it gets hidden, not hidden, but covered in a variety of things. And for example, the DAC a few years back counted housing refugees as foreign aid. A, because they had to do it, and B, it was spent in whichever the country is, and B, the public would say, oh yeah, well that's fair enough. The countries from which the refugees came from says, hang on, what about us? So there's a whole question there about how aid is framed, and part of it is to do with internal politics, basically. It's usually not as sinister as people say. It's just practical politics.
Yeah, and I was thinking about something. I lurk a lot on very random internet sites, and this is a question from there. Global South has always been seen as a recipient, as you've said, and it's the fact that it has been a prominent foreign donor is not something that's considered. And it's again, this is from a very shady, random, website. So please feel free to ignore if this question doesn't make any sense. But a lot of the conversation about global North being a foreign aid, giving foreign aid, is sort of also framed in a way that, in a manner that it's doing reparations for whatever their past history has been. And I don't know, I haven't done enough research to know if that is how the overall framing is, or that is how the global North perceives itself. But I wanted to know your thoughts about this. Like, does it even make sense? Like, is it something that should be even entertained, this conversation that, aid is actually a reparation in some form? If that is the case, then if that is how, let's say, the global North foreign aid is looked at, then where does the global South foreign aid fit in this in this conversation?
The whole reparations debate is an interesting one. Somebody put to us that we should do a special issue of development in practice about reparations. And my instinctive thing is rustling up 15 papers will be quite tricky. The reparations debate is mainly focused in the Caribbean, where leaders there, and this relates to the period of enslavement and those times. China, in Mao's time, sort of didn't seek reparations from Japan. But after Mao left in the mid-70s and Deng Xiaoping sort of took over, I think they did the whole reparations thing with Japan to get money. I'm not quite sure how public it was, but I'm sure there would have been some reminder about what they did in the 30s and before. So I mean, it's part of that. I think it's a little bit mixed. I suspect if India wouldn't ask for reparations because it would be a little bit humiliating for it, I think, in some respects. So it depends on the country. I don't think you'd have a widespread argument, and I don't think, I don't know, I don't think many global countries would see the reparations argument these days. Some would and some wouldn't. So I don't think it's a widespread thing. I think it's a good point to whether governments, the British are a bit vulnerable to reparations because they were so heavily involved in the slave trade. But in other places, it would be a little bit different. I mean, France tends to regard its colonies as part of it, and so when they've broken away, it's usually with hard feelings, and whether reparations come into the discussions is interesting. Portugal would love to keep good relations with Timor-Leste, but whether they would sort of see reparations as part of the discussion would be quite interesting.
Interesting. I wanted to understand from you that what might a dominant global South-led, development agenda would look like in terms of priorities and decision making?
A global South development agenda.
A global South-led. So let's say, we're just doing a practice, right? Imagining.
Yeah, I think the key thing they would like to do, as well as the infrastructure thing, because it's still nowhere near where it should be. When I say infrastructure, I mean little smallish infrastructure. Electricity. Most places in the global South don't have 24-hour electricity. Roads and all that sort of stuff. But apart from that, I think the trading system is still heavily skewed against them, and the global South tends to be seen as still as a factory to be exploited. So China is moving all its low-cost production to Africa in particular. So I think a fairer game there. And then the tech bros want to move their data centers to the global South. That won't give anybody in the global South 24-hour electricity. In fact, it'll take their electricity from them. So I think a global South-led agenda would be to move away from an exploitative relationship. Whether that's capitalist exploitation, which the tech bros are the latest manifestation of, but they've been around for a couple of centuries. The East India Company, for example, roads in Southern Africa, etc. So they're all corporate sort of colonialists. And we're coming back to a new set of corporate colonialists who are sort of putting their manufacturing and things in the global South, and again without the same rights and workers' rights, or etc. So the global South countries are on a take it or leave it basis in many cases in these matters. So that if the world was turned upside down And everybody said, yeah, sorry, we did all the wrong thing. We'll do what you wish. I mean, the new International Economic Order, which just had its 50th anniversary last year or the year before, I think it was last year, 1974, that the UN has sort of passed a reinforcing, a revisiting motion, but the global north just aren't interested in that sense. But that would be, to realise the new international economic order would be probably what the global south would want.
Mm. And I was thinking something as you were speaking that often what happens is when we again club together these, very different, and different in power differentials, these countries, let's say China versus some other South Asian or East Asian country or some other African country, let's say. It's the power differentials are so great between these countries that it's kind of unfair to put everyone under the same umbrella, because even within the global south there are these, arm twistings happening. There are, I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
I several years ago I read that, I think, I mean, I don't want to be saying something on a public platform without fact checking, but I think in some uh, East African country, probably India, there was some Indian investment in roads, uh, I mean, land for roads or something like, yeah, I don't
Mm,
want to be going into this
mm,
because I'm
mm,
sure I'm quoting it wrong. But essentially, and there was some discontent amongst, let's say, the country and India, and
mm.
it played out politically very differently. But yeah, like all of these happen, and we again to sort of correct the wrong that has been made, in the sense that there's been a heavy global north centric conversation. Often these problematic arm twistings are overlooked in a hurry
Mm.
to compensate that spotlight has not been given. So with this, I was wondering, as researchers, as students, as practitioners who sort of engage in this space, like what role could, the this community could play in documenting as well as theorizing these sudden led initiatives, and yeah, and what are the things that we should be sort of be cautious about?
I think the problem that researchers have is access.
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard to study Chinese aid
Mm,
because you don't have access. You can have access to the recipient, but even they would be very careful because you can soon break a relationship. So all you get is the public sort of things, which is uh, often a bit of political theatre to get to particular points. But looking at articles about foreign aid in Africa, virtually none of them mention China
mm,
because nobody talks about it. It's not mentioned in the newspapers. There's no press releases. It all happens below the radar. But unless it's very big, China just announced it's rebuilding the Tanzam Railway. You can't not rebuild it without somebody noticing, you know. But then in return, they get a 30-year concession on it, which means they can use that to extend their own interest into Zambia and Tanzania and places and build their industries there and that sort of thing. But it's very hard for researchers to get a handle on that because you don't have the access. And as you know, getting access is a very complicated process. And so researchers tend to go for what is the easier, and for a whole lot of reasons, not all, but many Western countries are more amenable to researchers looking into their stories. The United States less so, but most of the West are less fussed by it. But it'd be very hard to get information about Turkey's aid to Central Asia, to Saudi aid, to the Arab countries, China's aid to almost anywhere. Um,
mm,
Also, the sources of the information is usually diverse. It's fairly decentralized, I think. So they won't have a central place which keeps all this. You know, the people in the centre just say, go out and do stuff and don't get it wrong. but often that's not that understood. So we end up as researchers uh, taking what's easier to do because it's very hard to get access. Occasionally people do, and they dig up some fascinating stuff. But also in this era of nationalism we're coming, it's much harder to get access to anything from anybody.
That a follow-up question, how did you manage access when you were doing your work? And you still are, but how did you manage these, whether it's language, whether it's getting access to those printed articles?
Most of my recent stuff for the last 15 years, 10, 15 years, is actually being archives. And that's why history's okay. History's nice and safe. So archives, but history I find history fascinating because it continually echoes. I won't say it repeats itself, but it certainly echoes. We can see what's happening right now and see the echoes in the past quite easily. So in that respect, and a lot of, particularly in the 50s, the leaders then were larger than life. And so they were they had biographies about them, coming out their ears. And in mine, it's been connections. So having worked for an NGO, when I went to southern India, I just went word of mouth. So I went to the field office and I said, well, I want to look at this, this, and this. Who should I see? Oh, go see this agency. Then I went, saw, who should I see? Go. So it'd become a snowballing thing, and I end up sort of digging up 15 very interesting local NGOs, which did interesting stuff. And I was able to get a picture of that level of diversity. But a lot of people, now I don't understand too catty, but a lot of people will talk to Sewa because it has an image, or Brak in Bangladesh, but Brak is very closed about, in terms of its own access. It allows access, but you can't really go. The Grameen Bank, you can talk about it, but you don't have much access to it. So you end up having to sort of find NGOs which are happy to talk. And sometimes you come across government officials which are very happy to talk, particularly at the district level. District commissioners love talking about what wonderful stuff they do.
Yeah, so what you're saying is that essentially it's the access sort of that kind of shapes what is produced in print, how much of a research you're able to do. And like you said, that a lot of if a certain kind of material is overwhelmingly accessible, then you tend to shape your version of your whatever you're writing in that direction. So that's very interesting because yeah, for researchers, access is always going to be something that kind of gatekeeps what they eventually are able to produce in print. We are almost at the close of our conversation. I just wanted to ask you one last thing, and it's you know you have been documenting the history of since the 19 I think before 1940s actually, about the global South and what led to it. So I was wondering if you could give us, let's say, one highlight. It's a lot I'm asking you to do, but one highlight of every decade until you know um, until today, if possible. If not, until how much you've done research, that is one. So a highlight of each decade. Number two, what and like where do you think this the South cooperation stands today. So, yeah, highlight and what you think about today.
Well, I'll start at 1900 and the Boxer Rebellion in China. The Boxer
Mhm.
Rebellion's interesting because it led to, it was one set of NGOs kicking out another set of NGOs, which you don't often have direct. And the Boxers were local martial arts groups, and they were against Western missionaries, which was a bit of a cover for more complex political story. But it led to China becoming a republic, and then they got snubbed at the Versailles Peace Conference, and Japan got the German treaty ports, and didn't come back to China, which led to the May 4th movement, which is another student movement, which some debated, but it probably led to the formation of the Communist Party of China, so it had that. So that's that I like that one because it's interesting. And there's also the whole colonial sort of, let's put down the uprising with this massive military force, which ultimately backfired. The Boxer Rebellion also had reparations, which is interesting, is that China had to pay the West reparations amounting to 1 year's taxation, total taxation, but it was never paid because it was just almost too embarrassing. So each Western country turned those reparations into development in China. So they built infrastructure, roads, hospitals, schools, what have you. Tsinghua University was from that reparations thing, which is an interesting aid story. The 1920s, probably the conference, mental block in Belgium, Brussels, where there was 130 people attended, representing 37 colonies, all crying for independence. And that saw the rise of Jawaharlal Nehru and Muhammad Hatta from India and Indonesia. And it was their first exposure to what global organizing could do. And so while the League Against Imperialism, which came out of it, collapsed because the Soviet Union just didn't like it, but that was important. But that led to the 40s. The 30s was just a non-event. Most of the Global South leaders were in prison in the 30s. And the League of Nations fell apart. But in the 40s, what was interesting was, apart from the United Nations was founded actually when Nehru and the leaders were still in prison. But shortly after they were let out, they became important in the United Nations. And Nehru had an Asian Relations Conference 4 months before formal independence, which actually had crowds of 10,000 people listening to the addresses. It was a call for independence, but a united call of Asia. So that was important. 50s, Bandung Conference, Asia Africa Conference, which had how many countries? Anyway, about 40 or 50 countries came together. And they had conversations. Importantly, Zhou Enlai from China was there, and he did a complete charm offensive, particularly with Gamal Abdel Nasser from Egypt. And so the following year, China started an aid program in Egypt. But Bandung sort of led to the non-aligned movement. Most of the people at Bandung were actually aligned either to the Soviet Union or the United States, but there were enough there to sort of think, hang on, let's have a non-aligned conversation. The 60s that's the decade of development. So there wasn't a single thing in the 60s, but basically UNCTAD, the group of 77. So there's a whole push from the Global South for a voice. In the 1970s, there's a new international economic order, which ultimately failed, but it was yet another voice for the Global South. And the oil crisis resulted in a big boost in aid from the global south, mainly from Saudi Arabia and China. The 80s is probably this. It's hard to think of a single event. It was a bit of the whole debt crisis and stuff was a very bad period for the global south. China fell back while it developed itself. The 1990s was interesting because China came back big time because the global south supported China at the time of Tiananmen Square. But there's an Asian financial crisis. An interesting thing about that was the IMF and the World Bank lost out. Countries started to do their own thing. Malaysia said no. Well, Mahathir said no. And Anwar Ibrahim wanted to go against him and ended up in prison. But nevertheless, and so the IMF ended up having its own debt crisis in the early 2000s because nobody would borrow from it anymore. So there was another pushback then. The early 2000s, nothing in particular except China had the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation was important because there was a continent-wide coming together to talk to China as a donor, which built on what happened in the 60s with Zhou Enlai, except they formalized it much more. And that struck me as very important. 2010s, now I'm starting to lose. The 2020s is interesting, where you have the United States literally leaving the field. And so that'll pan out with a bit of a global reshaping. And I think China will be very much at the center of it because that's tied to global politics in quite a way. So there's my potted sort of best events. I haven't quite worked out what happened in the 2010s, but
no, this was helpful because it helps, to get a quick sort of recap of what led to where we are today, and like you said, history echoes. So what can we expect going forward? How history is going to be echoing, if not repeating. That's it from me, Patrick. I check. Do we have any questions from a YouTube? I completely understand. It's late Friday. Oh, sorry, it's Wednesday evening, and we've been hosting this to accommodate a lot of time zones. But so far, I think we don't have any questions. I'm just gonna check once more. Super. Okay. So great. So that's it from us. Patrick, thank you so much for giving us your time, and
thank you.
and of course, special thanks to Jemmy for showing us, for being there for the whole talk. I'm pretty sure Jemmy has some important stuff to add, but maybe some other day. But thank you so much, Patrick, again for a very um, detailed discussion on where we are today and what the history has been and why it's important to shatter the myth of emerging donor and look at it from a perspective that does not repeat again, that basically challenges these nuances, these labelings of emerging. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Hope everyone has a lovely evening, day, afternoon, wherever you're joining us from. And once again, thanks, Patrick. And just to repeat, whatever Patrick has been writing on this topic is available on his ResearchGate, and also this amazing podcast that he's hosting on patrick.podbean, I think, which we can link.
There's Podbean, and you can use it under my name, and also Substack, also under my name.
Right, perfect. So we'll have it out in our comms, so everybody should have access to it. Super. Thank you again. Goodbye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Have a good one. Thank you.
It's been a
Bye-bye.
great conversation.
All right then. Bye-bye.
Bye.